Longevity Tonic, a series of events exploring human life and longevity through the prism of art, history, philosophy, and literature. When we founded the forum in 2018, Jim, Andrew, and I knew that to deliver on our ambition of promoting long, healthy, and fulfilling lives from as many people as possible, we needed to really broaden the understanding of longevity among as many people as possible. What better way to promote this mission than by seeking to understand the future through the prism of the past? In our first event, our expert speaker, Father Michael Collins, a renowned art historian and author, as well as a dear friend of the Longevity Forum, took us on a visual journey through ancient Egypt, which I thought was particularly given the scenes of mummies passing through Cairo last week, which you also saw. Today, we will travel to ancient Greece to explore the legacy that this civilization has left on humanity through our political and educational systems, philosophy, science, and of course, the subject of our webinar today, the arts. So I'll hand over to Father Michael, and please do send 3 questions, which will be answered at the end of the lecture. Thank you.
I'm afraid of the Greeks when they're bearing gifts. Now, that's not a xenophobic comment. It actually was written over 2,000 years ago by the Roman poet Virgil, and he puts it into the mouth of the priest Laocoon, who is standing at the walls of Troy watching the Greeks besiege it. Eventually, they decide to give a gift of a horse to get into the city of Troy with soldiers. This horse is a gift loaded with soldiers who are going to run through the streets, obviously, and take the city from the inside. But even if I say xenophobic, or if I use any of the words that we use in common parlance today, either in English, German, or any of the Romance languages, this comes, in essence, from its roots in Greece. And we are the heirs to so much of Greek culture. It really is one of the great cradles of Western civilization. So we see all around us, even today, in our language, our art, our architecture, in all our various elements, which we use as part of our everyday existence, the remains of the Greek heritage. And this is what I'd like to share with you now. Greece is recognized as the cradle of Western civilization. Greek thinkers shaped philosophy and political systems which are still relevant 2,500 years later. When we think of the heritage of ancient Greece, what it gave to us, politics, the concept of aristocracy and democracy, the myths of the gods and goddesses of Mount Olympus, the games which are held even in the modern era in honor of the athletes of old, the alphabet which forms the base of our modern alphabet today, the philosophy which had such an enormous impact in the way we think, and the art and the architecture which is all around us. So much of the iconography, so much of the thought process came from ancient Greece. The basic building techniques continue to underpin our modern architecture. The literature range from drama to sophisticated satire. Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey emerge from a period before the invention of writing, from an oral tradition, and recount violent wars and conflict. The Milesian philosophers were the first to pose and formulate the 3 fundamental questions: where do we come from? Why are we here? And whither are we going? These questions inspired generations of thinkers who unraveled the complex issues of the day, observing the world around them. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are the best known of a panoply of thinkers who wrestled with the phenomenon of existence. The Greeks saw themselves at the center of their world. They were surrounded by beauty and by ugliness. And they tried to make sense of the world to which they contributed and of which we now are the proud inheritors. It would be impossible to give an overview of ancient Greece in just a few moments. So I've chosen at the very beginning to look at part of the civilization of the island of Crete in the southern part of the Greek Mediterranean. Looking at the Minoan civilization, at the palace of Knossos, which is on the island of Crete, which dates back around 4,000 years ago. The palace complex was probably built around 4,000 years and was destroyed possibly by fire 300 years later in around 1700 BC. Of course, it's very difficult for us to give precise dates on anything that we talk about because we don't have the names of the artists and architects. They never signed their works. But what we have are just remnants, very frustrating remnants, really, when we look at the beauty of what they achieved. And this civilization was extraordinarily advanced. At our last meeting, we looked at the origins of Egyptian civilization, which of course were really close neighbors of the Cretans, a civilization which goes back 5,000 years. So here we are, very close to that. And when we look at the decorations and when we look at what the artist chose to depict, we see what the priorities were. We don't have any written examples of how they thought. And so we have to rely on these fragments, much of which have been reconstructed, so we can almost hear the music. We can almost hear the words. We can almost hear the sounds of the ancient world, but not quite. We can imagine how they danced, how they moved, how they had their sports. And one of the most important sports was the dancing with the bull or the bull throwing. When athletes, much like in modern day Spain, would take on a bull in order to prove which was the greater, which had the greater power. And from these fragments, we can piece together a glimpse of what that life was like. And if we look at these images, which date back almost 4,000 years, we know that the palace was destroyed in 1700 BC. And as we pick out these little pieces, which lay undisturbed until Sir Arthur Evans and British archaeologists began to uncover them at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, we can imagine and we can recreate how they lived, what rule they had. But it all seems to have disappeared around, archaeologists will argue over the dates, but around 14 to 1300 BC. We don't know why. Was it an earthquake? Was it even a tsunami from a nearby volcanic eruption? We don't know. But what we do have are glimpses which have been taken up and then used by subsequent Greeks. Homer was the bard of love and war. He lived in the 8th century. We don't know where he came from. He's very much the subject of myth, but he gave us an insight to how the Greeks lived hundreds of years ago. And he told of the tales of gods and goddesses and their interaction and their influence on humanity. And we all know the names of Hera, Zeus, Poseidon, Apollo, Hermes, Mercury. All of these names, indeed many of these names, were carried over and became Venus and Jupiter, etc., in the Roman world when the Romans conquered the Greeks. And of course, we'll talk about that again on another occasion when we see how the Romans who conquered the Greeks were conquered by their culture, by their language, by their passions, by their poetry, by their literature, by their art, by their architecture, by their whole civilization. Homer gave us the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Iliad, which tells of the destruction of the town of Troy, the famous wooden horse, and the return of Odysseus to his homeland. Now, whether Homer actually wrote these, of course, remember, this was a verbal, if you like, a verbal society, which was passing down these poems, memorized from one generation to the next. But the themes are all unique and all of them universal, of love, of war, of revenge, betrayal, and of death. When we think of ancient Greece also, we think of the great philosophers. Just to recite a few: Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, Diogenes, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, Pythagoras. The list goes on for 100 more names that we could add in, but these are probably some of the names which are best known to us. Raphael, in the early 16th century, made a wonderful fresco in the Apostolic Palace at the Vatican, where he placed Plato and Aristotle at the very center of the discussion of the Greek philosophers. And as he gathered all the names of these great philosophers, we can imagine them and we can hear them discussing their belief, the world in which they lived. What was it made from? What element was it made from? Even the word element comes from Greek. Where did it stand within the universe? At that time, certainly it wasn't believed that the sun and the earth were in the same relationship as we see today. So we're dealing with a different world, but the questions are all similar. Probably best summed up in the words of Protagoras, the 5th century philosopher, who stated that man is the measure of all things. To say that is an example of great arrogance or great confidence. And indeed, from our own perspective today, as we confront climate change, our need to change our provision of food and energy, we might say that man is the measure of all things for the moment, but in a few short years may be swept away, and the earth will replace humanity with another form of life in the majority. Hippocrates was one of the most important figures of the ancient world in terms of medicine and in terms of understanding the human body, how it worked. In this image, we see Artaxerxes, the king, coming to the great doctor and asking for his advice and laying all the riches that he had. And Hippocrates, of course, puts out his hand and says, "No, I don't need money for what I'm doing. I work for the good of people, regardless of their wealth, regardless of their status in society. I work for the human person." And of course, the dignity of the human person, the centrality of the human person, whether it's an act of arrogance or an act of confidence, is central to the Greek way of thinking. Hippocrates, whose dates are 460 to 370 according to history, well, we can't even know that because the only biography that we have of Hippocrates was written 500 years after his death. So we really would need a very, very good memory to be sure of that. But among the various things which he is credited with is defining disease as being caused by the disorders of blood, bile, and phlegm. Bile, which he divided into yellow bile and black bile. So in other words, when he'd observe somebody vomiting, he would examine what he saw before him. So he's very much somebody who made a diagnosis, once more a Greek word, a diagnosis, and worked out a prognosis, once more a Greek word, how the person was going to proceed in their illness. And he noted, of course, that disease is caused externally. For example, a sword cut is going to perhaps give you a wound which can fester, or it can be internal, maybe a cancer, a tumor, something which erupts from the inside. And that will lead to a crisis, which will bring you to a divisional point. Crisis, once more a Greek word, means judgment. So it's a decision, what's going to happen next? Either you heal or you deteriorate and die. So that is the job of the medic, to try and intervene, to help and to promote your healing and to avoid the possibility of death. So close to what our present day hopes of longevity are for. We don't simply want to live extra years in this world, but we want to live them with good health of mind and of body, and also to live in a proper status within society, a well-ordered polis, a well-ordered society. The code of conduct for medics was then central because so many people saw what Hippocrates was was doing and were impressed by what he was doing. He simply counseled things like diet and exercise, eat well and walk well, apparently. He prescribed medication, which was most often in those days herbal, and occasional surgery. And he carried out even surgery on the lungs. So the human body was central, if you like, to this part of human thought which we're examining today. A fundamental example of this were the athletic games. Running, javelin throwing, boxing, wrestling, chariot racing were among the most important things, which were held very often when a war was concluded and the soldiers came back to their local town or village, and they put on a display of the skills which they had learned during their war endeavors and during their maneuvers. I think in those days, what did they have? A shield, a helmet, a sword, a javelin, nothing more. And yet that became the basis of their games, the athletic games. And because so many battles ended in death, indeed the large-scale death of so many people, very often these athletic games were performed in memory of those who had died. The bodies of the dead probably had remained on the battlefield while the soldiers had returned to their dispersed homes. But nevertheless, they gathered once more to commemorate and to honor those who had died. When somebody died under normal circumstances, perhaps from age, and let us keep in mind that the average age, the average span of age at the time when we're speaking was probably around 35 to 40 years of age. The body was laid on a bier, the proskathanos, laid out on a bier so that the body could be prepared, anointed with oil, cleaned, washed, dressed, and the mourners, the family and friends, could come and offer their words of comfort to the remaining members of the family and to the close ones. And once more, in this attic painting, we have an image of the horse races, the chariot races, which are held in honor of the dead. So many of the great vases and pottery work which we have today comes from that spoliation of the tomb, the preparation of the tomb for the person who has died. And here we have Hades and his wife Persephone ready to greet those who are on their way to Hades, into the underworld, a place of shadows, a place where people lived on after their death. And so many of these beautiful works of art have been unearthed by archaeologists from the tombs, and they give us a glimpse. They give us a moment to reflect on the world in which they lived, which was very much governed by the force of arms. Soldiers were fundamental. Remember where soldiers and the army came from. The soldier and the army was simply comprised of the sons of farmers. That's what they were. But we're allowed to glimpse everyday life, a woman washing, young men wrestling and engaged in their athletic forms, men on horseback, the master of transport. And so many of the items we also find from the graves of those who have died. In this bas-relief, we find the grave of a young man marked in profile. And we find that the artist has a very clear idea of the measurements of the person. And this was fundamental in coming to understand how the Greek artist represented their model. The young man with his beautifully curled hair, in Kytheron, a band which runs over his brow. The brow, of course, which was originally made in order to prevent perspiration obscuring his sight during exertions. And then we have the little water jar, which is a symbol of his journey on from this world. And of course, much of the Greek world was comprised of myth. And so we have these mythical characters, this griffin, this figure of a lion's body with wings and then a human face. This may, in fact, reflect back to the concept of the Ba and the Ka, the immortal soul of the Egyptians, which was a very complex idea of the will, the intellect, the memory, the concept, and the intention of the human person, but which in Greek was simply summed up as the psyche, as the soul, as the essence of that person. And these were usually placed outside the city walls because people were either cremated or buried outside the city walls. And these were set up generally, of course, by people who had a certain amount of wealth to commission the artist to pay for the material, which was most often of terracotta or of marble. And so these people have been preserved for us, unearthed by archaeologists, and placed on display so that we can learn from them. And we can try and understand what went on in their minds. And that's why we are so fortunate to have the philosophy of the Greeks, their plays, their comedies, which have been preserved and translated for us into the present day, their myths, their thoughts, their concepts, all of these which are so fundamental. But let us look for a moment at the human body and the early ways in which the Greeks displayed the human body. This statue, dating perhaps back to the 7th century BC, 2,700 years or so old, is called a geometric statue. It's a simple human figure in geometrical terms because the artist has simply refined the human body to shapes. We can recognize the limb, the torso, the woman's breasts of this ritual statue, a goddess, or this very common form of statue of a young man. Very often these were placed as a votive offering after funeral games or after athletic games performed by not only soldiers, but by young men of the village. And they were always depicted naked because even though people, of course, at that time wore clothes, this was the best way of depicting the human body. Clothes were only worn to keep us warm. That was the purpose. But here they are shown in all their splendor and in all their nature. The elaborate hairstyles, the body shows us that this is a young man. And these also may represent either a god such as Apollo or Zeus, or they may represent the face and the body of the person who has died. And again, it's very difficult for us to identify these properly and to be sure of which we are looking. But we are able to identify the type of face because from the 7th to the 5th century, face always bore this enigmatic smile. It's called the Attic smile, the Attic face. The early statues were always made of either terracotta or of bronze. And as the years progressed, we find that the artistry advanced. So the stance of the figures became more varied so that the statue would not fall over. Very often one foot was placed in front of the other, or a hand and an arm was moved in order to allow the statue find its balance so that it could not topple over easily. So the artist not only was giving us a direct representation of the human body, but was also working within the proportions and using the material, the bronze, an expensive material, which although hollow on the inside, could naturally be unbalanced. These statues also were made of stone, but very often in the Roman era, we'll find copies of an original statue. In this young boy from the 4th century in Athens, we find again the curled hair, the perfect smile, and already we can probably identify who this person is because there's a feature there. It may not be readily identifiable, but the proportions are absolutely perfect. And in the eyes of the sculptor and the patron who commissioned this statue, this must have represented the young person. Female statues were represented, but more often in the early years as clothed, with a great concentration on the hairstyles, the elaborate hairstyles, which were important in the past and as important today. And as the years went on, of course, the artists became more sure of what they were doing, and they were able to allow their statues adopt more athletic poses. And they were able to allow their statues move. This is interpreted as either the god Zeus or Poseidon. In truth, we don't know, but it's probably a statue of a god. And once more, we find that although the face is generic, there is some way in which we could identify it. These bronzes of Riace, found off the coast of Riace in southern Italy in the 1970s, emerged from the sea, having lain there for hundreds of years. And yet, because they were made of bronze, of course, they could be taken out, polished and restored and placed on display. And these larger-than-life statues allow us to look and admire the complete mastery that the artist had developed. It was almost an anatomy. It was almost a perfection of eye which they had mastered. We don't know who these gods are, or if they're simply humans, or were they gladiators, or were they important athletes. It's not possible to know. But we do know the world from which they came, and we can see the extraordinary mastery in the elaborate curls, in the combed beard, in the eyelashes which are applied, and the enamel eyes which unfortunately have been lost since. The athletes played a variety of games. Discus throwing was one of the most popular. And again, it gave the artist a tremendous ability to show the mastery of the counterpoint of the human body. Here in this statue, a copy of the 4th century artist Myron, we have a discus thrower, Discobolus, the discus thrower, who is preparing to launch his flat disc into the air. And we're just caught in this moment of time as an insect caught in amber, just frozen. But again, this was the inspiration for so many copies. The female, as I mentioned, was usually portrayed as clothed, which gave the artist a great ability to show the drapes and their mastery of clothing. But also by the 4th and into the 2nd century, females were shown naked as well. And this was the first time that they'd been shown entirely naked, because prior to this, the statue of the goddesses were always clothed. The artist has chosen this figure. We cannot be sure who the figure is, but the artist has chosen an absolute, once more, has the absolute perfection of the human body in every movement, in every muscle. And once more, we can see the image of the face is a recognizable woman. So we've moved forwards by a few hundred years. We've moved forward into portraying the actual person, not just an image. But the artist was very much aware also of the deformed image. In the ancient world, people suffered with the number of deformities as today. And they were also caught and captured by the artist. As in this beautiful bronze of a sleeping Cupid. The infant has fallen asleep, and look at the complete relaxation of the body. In the 4th century, the great Macedonian king Alexander the Great extended, first of all, united Greece, and then extended the Greek world eastwards into Persia and into India. And at the great battle of Issus, he confronted the king Darius and conquered Darius. And we see Alexander on the far left about to hurl a javelin towards the king, whose army are defended him with javelins aimed at the Macedonian army. And it was through this conquest that Alexander was able to gather Greek culture and bring it eastwards into the world, which at that stage had not yet been discovered. Alexander introduced, therefore, the Greek language, the koine, the common language of the people, the koine, common Greek of the people. He brought that eastwards, even as far as Greece, where he himself was to be buried at the age of 33 when he died in 323 BC. At the end of his short life, he had managed to unite, to conquer, and to subdue so many lands under his rule. And in all those lands, and think, he was the pupil of Aristotle. There's a wonderful story when he's asked to move out of the shade he's asked to move out by providing shade for the philosopher. And there's a wonderful image of Alexander, the great ruler of the world, bowing to the knowledge of the older man. So what Alexander did was he brought this language, he brought culture, he brought the thought process to a whole new world. And that was to have extraordinary ramifications, which we will be seeing in the future. And then in this wonderful statue, a 2nd century statue of the sleeping faun, we find the epitome of the Greek mastery of the human body. The artist here has captured a male body, evidently in his 30s or 40s, fully developed, no longer a youth with thin waist. This is a fully developed man, but it's more than simply a statue of a person, because this statue almost comes to life in our sight. And so we've moved from a standing statue of a young man representing almost an ideal to a fully embodied human spirit or psyche. And we can see and we can experience the emotions of this man. We don't know in what state he is. Curiously, we know that he's a satyr, so he's semi-man, semi-beast. And yet the artist is showing us, evidently using a live model, is showing us an insight into the mind of that person who's so completely at rest. And the facial features, combined with the complete languidity of the body and the fluidity of the body, even though he perches uncomfortably on a rock, the facial features express something about him which is entirely otherworldly, inviting us to penetrate through his eyes, behind his eyes, using the artist's eyes to understand what he's thinking of, what thoughts are in his head, or is his head entirely vacant? The artist was able to cast in bronze or to sculpt in marble. If there were any wooden statues or wooden works of art, these have largely perished. So we are extraordinarily fortunate to have the bronze, which have survived, although in lesser quality and quantity than the marbles, because bronze, being a valuable material, could be melted down and reutilized. Once more, we rely on this, a copy of the Laocoon, the story of the priest of Troy, who with his sons comes out onto the beach and urges the Greeks the Trojans not to believe in the Greeks, even when they're bearing gifts, the gift of the Trojan horse. And serpents emerge from the waves and they encircle themselves around the body of the priest. The snake bites into the hip of the priest and his sons are squeezed to death by the python-like tail. Once more, the artist is able to display so much feeling and anguish with the facial expression of these figures. As we conclude, perhaps one of the most famous figures, again dating from the height of our classical antiquity, at the perfection, at the moment of the greatest achievement, mistakenly called the Dying Gall. Originally, this statue was made from bronze and then later copied many, many times in marble, of which we have several copies. But here we find simply a young man who perhaps has fallen in battle or who is just simply resting on his shield. But we do know from a wound in his side that he already has been injured. And so he probably has fallen to the ground. And in this moment of falling in weakness, he meditates or he pauses to catch his breath, to see what's happened. So the artist has brought us into this snap moment to examine what has happened to this young man. Once more, the face is able to express so much, not simply the body and the complete mastery of the body, but the face is also able to explain to us that moment of disbelief at the wound which has been inflicted unexpectedly as he falls to the ground, his hair matted with sweat. As he leans and props himself up upon the shield, as he lightly holds on to his leg, not believing what has happened, that he has fallen, and that now he faces his death.
Well, thank you, Father Michael. That was wonderful, and we learned a lot, and what a dramatic ending. Well, we have a few questions for you today. Let's see. Okay, let's start out with, could you please say a little more about the mythology of Greek gods and immortality? Was Hercules the only one to earn immortality in death?
Well, that's a very interesting question and a vast topic, of course, because mythology, both in Greece and in Rome, is still pertinent today, and everybody can recite the gods, Jupiter to Venus to Mercury to Mars, etc., etc., etc. There's a rhyme we learned as children. And again, that's part of what I mentioned earlier, the Greek civilization, the Greek culture, the heritage which we have from that part of the world. Hercules is certainly, yes, he's one of the great achievers. He's a human who then is made into a god. Asclepius, the god of medicine, was also, according to the early stories related in Homer's era, he was human and he also then was divinized. So I suppose they will be two, possibly there are more, but they're the two that I'm aware of.
Okay, great. And this is an interesting question. Now, this is about Shakespeare and Marlowe. To what extent were these great classics seminal and sources to the works of Marlowe and Shakespeare?
Oh, of huge importance. I mean, you take several, Timon of Athens, Julius Caesar, so many of these. And again, doesn't that prove what I'm trying to say, that somebody like Shakespeare, whom we regard as the god of the English language in the 16th century, when we look at somebody like this, he looks back then to Homer and to the stories of the gods and goddesses, and they're still pertinent, and people packed into the globe, they packed into the theatres in those days. Okay, they didn't have webinars and computers and television and cinemas, etc. But they had these great stories. And as I say, that's what I think is so important for us to realize, that we are the heirs of this extraordinarily rich heritage. And it's not that we've just arrived and it stopped with us, but we, I hope, will pass this on to our next generation. In fact, I remember a few years ago, one of my nephews, I gave him for his communion, religious ritual, I gave him for his present a copy of the Greek and Roman gods and goddesses, and he was very excited. But his cousin was in the car, one of my other nephews, and he looked at the book with dead jealousy, and he said, "That's not fair. When I made my communion, I just got a Bible." But you know, when you think of it, the Bible was full of all these great stories as well, because every culture, every nation, every people looks back to its stories, and psychiatrists would all tell you that all the phobias that we have, there's another Greek word, phobia, all the things that we display today are as a result of some of these issues which have been turned into stories in the past. And we suffer with insomnia, another word which comes through Greek into Latin to us, you know. So anyway, I won't go on too long.
That's great. And so what did the ancient Greeks believe happened after one died, and if it was a definitive end?
Well, that's very interesting. There was a concept in all the ancient cultures of an afterlife, and I think that's probably the most important thing to note, that virtually every civilization that we look at across the globe over the centuries, and we can go back maybe 500 years, 5,000 years, it's always the same. There is that search for an afterlife. And the Greeks did believe in a place of shadows, as I mentioned, a place of Hades, that you would go at the end of your life, but it was ill-defined. And that's kind of interesting as well. There's the gods and goddesses who oversee the underworld, but it's not a place from which you would easily return. There's the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, etc. There are some exceptions, but by and large, when you die, and that's why you must always seek to die in virtue. The Greeks had this great concept that you lived an honorable life. Now, they didn't always do that, but the concept, the goal was to live a good moral life. And then you look at somebody like Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, and indeed many of the other Greek philosophers. That's what they were always trying to discuss. That's what they were always fascinated by. How do you live the good life? Is it an Epicurean life where you just take the pleasures, or is it a life of stoicism? I made a mistake actually. I realized when I mentioned that Alexander, first of all, he was buried, of course, in Egypt, but also it was Diogenes of Sinope that in front of whom he stood with the sun. But again, all of these stories are so important because they're expressing how we try and live our lives as best we can.
That's really nice. Now, touching on that, on virtue, what do you think was the greatest legacy that ancient Greece left to humanity, especially what's relevant to the future?
I think I'm biased when I say this, but my answer would be art. Oh. I think again, this is something which is visible. Okay, we can certainly talk, and we've mentioned there the gods and the goddesses, the literature, Homer, etc. And then we've so many great plays and great works, etc. And after all, they gave us the language. The language which we use today, as I say, is largely made up of Greek words. But nevertheless, I think art is tremendously important. And moving forward, even doing things like 3D or computer graphics, etc., still we're going back and we're using the old images, the helix, we're using the algebra, we're using the trigonometry, we're using all these things which the Greek mathematicians worked out. Because if you look at it, art isn't simply about melting bronze and pouring it into a cast and then chipping away the cast and having a beautiful statue. It's not about just taking marble and chipping it away in order to give it a form, but it's also about studying the materials, the method, the weight, the measurements, etc. So that's why art, that's the word.
That's great. And we also have a follow-up question on artists in Greece. Were there patrons of the arts, and how were artists paid?
Oh, that's a great question. Always there were patrons of the arts, and it's important to say that nobody did anything for free. I think that's the way it is today. But in those days, you didn't walk around with a commission of paintings under your arm and try and sell them. No. You always needed a patron. And why? The reason for this was because the materials were extraordinarily expensive. Bronze, as I told you, was prohibitively expensive. But marble, which was regarded as a good deal cheaper, even that was expensive because it had to be quarried, it had to be transported, and then it had to be placed in situ when it was bought. So that was one issue. But even things like paints and pigments, they were expensive as well. And some of them, like we're going to see when we go to the Renaissance period, ultramarine was as valuable as gold because it was only mined in Afghanistan. It was a single hue, which was extraordinarily valuable. But if we move back into, let's say, the Roman and the Greek world, the same thing applied. So therefore, you needed a patron, and therefore you had to be a wealthy person. And that's why the burden fell on the wealthy people. And they didn't simply want to glorify themselves. That happened as well. But they wanted to commemorate something which was important. And so often, we'll find in the Greek world, but more visibly in the Roman world, we find that the patrons, let's say the emperors, the wealthy senators, etc., they commission works of art which are for the public good, the res publica. It's for the good of the people, the things that the people can enjoy. So we'll find the Colosseum, we'll find the great baths, we'll find the monuments, etc., all for the people, made by the patrons.
Great. And what was your view on the Elgin Marbles?
Well, the Elgin Marbles is pretty controversial because they were found by Lord Thomas Bruce at the end of the 18th century, the turn of the 19th century, I think in about 1800 or 1801. And he was the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire at the time. And of course, Greece formed at that period part of the Ottoman Empire. So he was told, according to the tradition that according to the story that he told when he got back to London, he said that the Sultan gave him permission to export what he wanted as a thank you gift for all the wonderful work that the British had done as ambassadors in the Ottoman Empire. I think he was just imagining this, or else he was just spinning a story. But the issue is now today, they're in the British Museum, so should they be returned someday to Greece? My view is that in general, items probably, this is my view, purely personal view, probably need not be returned. But I think what should be done is perfect, identical replicas ought to be supplied free of charge, obviously, and then shipped to the place. So it may make more sense to make absolute perfect copies and give them as a gift to Greece. Now, there are copies there already, but well, why have two if you've got one? But I think that goes as a view which you could take across the whole world of art. The Benin statues are another example of art which is called back. The obelisk of somewhere in Ethiopia, Aksum in Ethiopia, that was returned when I was living in Rome. I remember that was returned to Ethiopia, and I was there the day it was actually dismantled and put on a cart and unceremoniously shipped off to Ethiopia. And I thought to myself, well, that doesn't make any sense because it was doing no harm. It wasn't even a particularly nice work of art in the middle of, it was opposite the Circus Maximus. So I think in general, my view would be just make a copy. We can make fantastic facsimiles today and why not send those?
That's great. Now, back to longevity. Did the Greeks search for longevity or perhaps a fountain of youth?
Well, now I must say I'm stumped. I don't know. I don't really know. I'll tell you what I do think is that when you look, if you read the philosophers, and again I go back to Plato and Aristotle because they're the ones that we're most familiar with, they were more concerned about the quality of your life, because you see, they didn't think they could have, I mean, for example, I'm not sure what age Plato and Aristotle were when they died, but we know that the average age, and I'm talking about average mean, was around 35 to 40. So if you hit your 60s, you were considered quite an elderly person. So I would say that what they were much more interested in was the virtue by which you lived your life. Now, if by virtuous you didn't drink too much, you took exercise, you didn't do various things which are foolish, which would endanger your health, that would make sense. But I don't think necessarily they were following after an elixir of life to get an extra 5, 10, 15 years. I never saw any evidence of that. I think what they were much more interested in was quality rather than quantity.
Okay, well, following up on quality of life, so the medicine was more of a holistic approach. How much exchange of knowledge did the Greeks have with the Indians and Chinese?
Another brilliant question. So I think we could go back with Alexander the Great. I mentioned that in the 4th century, his armies went eastwards. They went first of all to India, and then of course they went southwards, and then Alexander eventually went down to Egypt, etc., etc., etc. But it is interesting to, if you look at the map today, that China is on the other side of India. So of course there was trading between them, but that doesn't mean to say it's all written down. That doesn't mean to say that we have with recordings of all of this. But what we do know, for example, the Silk Roads, the travel roads, the trade routes, we do know that people were coming and going all the time. And there were various caravans or stages where people would stop and they'd maybe spend a night or two or rest, or there were hospices. And we do know, for example, that medications and medicaments were used to the surprise of some of the visitors. For example, they may have been traveling several hundred miles east or west. They got sick and they went in and they suddenly found themselves being treated by a Chinese doctor. And they were given a completely different form of medicine. As I mentioned earlier, Greek medicine was largely herbal, but Chinese medicine also had herbs as well, but it was probably different herbs. So it'll be quite interesting to follow that. But that's maybe another seminar, another webinar, somebody'd like to take that theme up.
That sounds very interesting. And for our last question, since we're running out of time, why did the Greek church become Orthodox?
Another interesting question. Well, that happened 1,000 years ago, and the reasons were two. One was political, and the other was theological, and the two so often go together. In the middle of the 11th century, the Normans were invading the south of the Italian peninsula and setting themselves up there. And the Pope in Rome at the time closed some of the Greek-speaking churches in the south of Italy, which at that time, of course, was called Magna Graecia. It was so much Greek influence in the south of Italy. And that was one of the reasons. And then the Patriarch of Constantinople refused to allow the Latin-speaking Christians in Constantinople to keep their churches open. So he closed them, and the two prelates came to blows. And Cardinal Humbert, who was the legate who had been sent over by the Pope Leo at the time, he excommunicated the Patriarch Michael Cellularius, and that was the split, and that happened in Hagia Sophia, which I see has just recently become a mosque once more. So it's fantastic history all over the place. That's why it's such a wonderful subject to study. So I think that's basically the reason. Politics and theology, bad twins, bad mix.
Oh, thank you so much again, Father Michael. This was all really marvelous. And we have another webinar coming up, Father Michael, in 2 weeks. We have Behind Rome's Eyes on Ancient Rome on Monday, 26 April at 5 p.m. London time. And you can sign up on our website, thelongevityforum.com. And if you don't mind, Father Michael, I have your trailer, which is really wonderful to watch to end this webinar. All right, I'm opening the trailer now. Thank you again, Father Michael.
Thank you.